Today, we're going to be talking about when God doesn't cooperate with us and take away our struggles, right? And I don't know if there's anybody out here today that's sitting here thinking, well, that doesn't apply to me. You know, God always takes away my struggles. God always listens, and he always does exactly what I want, when I want, how I want it. If you're sitting out here today and that's what you have to say, this talk's probably not for you. However, for the rest of us, I think a lot of us, we struggle with some of those big why questions, right? The questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? And do you sometimes ask yourself, every time something goes wrong in your life, you know, why me, Lord? Why is this happening to me? And what did I do wrong to cause this to happen? Do you ever find yourself perhaps just crying out? Just crying out to God for answers and asking Him, why is life throwing everything that it has at me and it doesn't seem to make any sense? And maybe sometimes I just want to know, where is God when I need Him? Where is He at when I need Him most? So somebody might be out here today, and maybe you're just like me, and maybe you became a Christian. And when you became a Christian, you found, just like I did, that life, its most difficult circumstances seemed to hit you right about that time. And that was my experience. I became a Christian, and almost immediately following that, it seemed like the whole world was coming down on me. And I had to ask myself, you know, what is it that I signed up for here, right? You know, what did I get myself into? I mean, really, all I wanted initially was some of that prosperity I'd heard about, right? I wanted some of those blessings. I wanted some of that grace that I'd heard so much about, maybe sprinkling a little bit of forgiveness, and I was pretty much good to go. That's what I was looking for. Well, you know, if you're hoping to get all of those difficult questions answered today, you're probably putting a little bit too much stock in this sermon, but I'm hoping that I can at least answer some of them for you today. And to be perfectly honest with you, though, I don't know that I have it completely figured out myself. I'm still sorting through it with you. And let's face it, we don't make it that easy to answer some of these questions, do we? You know, sometimes when life is difficult, I hear people say every time something goes wrong in somebody's life that it must be Satan. Right? It's always Satan's fault. Satan must be doing something in your life. That's why things are going wrong. And yet I hear others, when things go wrong, sometimes I hear others say, well, it must be God, right? It's got to be God, and He's testing you, right? You hear people in church, and they get that whispery voice, and they say, I think God's testing him, right? And so we don't know, is it God? Is it Satan? Is it, you know, I hear others say it's coincidence, it's karma, it's some other mystical force, and sometimes we just don't know. So how do we know? Which is it? Is it God? Is it Satan? What is it that's causing some of these struggles within my life? And I think there's a few things that we go through that are probably obvious, right? We could all probably agree on these, and they're probably obvious answers. If I asked you, is this Satan? You'd probably easily be able to answer the question. If I said, when a school shooting takes place and innocent children die, is it God or is it Satan? Right? Satan, right? If I asked you about evil temptations and when we face evil temptations, is it God? Is it Satan? Satan, right? And these are easy ones. How about a terrorist attack that takes place in the name of some false god? Easy one, right? That's Satan. And so some of those are obvious and we can quickly identify them. But what about the things that are perhaps less obvious and the things that we probably deal with every day in our lives that we just can't quite understand? Like, maybe I just lost my job. Perhaps my spouse is leaving me. Maybe I have a sick child or a terminally ill loved one in my family. How about some of you might be dealing with financial hardships today, or maybe a bankruptcy or something along those lines. Maybe you're about to lose your home and you just can't quite make sense of it. Or worse yet, maybe one of you was born into a Packers family. But in all seriousness, as you face the things, it only makes sense. It only makes sense to ask the question, is it God? Is it Satan? What is it? And the truth is this, I don't think that it matters. I really don't think it matters what's causing it. I think what matters is how we choose to respond to our situations It's regardless. You know, if we believe that God can do good out of all things, out of all situations, if we believe that He's going to bring us through it, and He's going to use it not only for our good, but for His purposes, then that's how we should look at responding. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not standing up here today trying to tell you that everything is good and everything is great, right? Because that's just not accurate, and it would be a mockery to say such a thing. And I know there are some things, right? The death of a child is not a good thing. The, person that's struggling with cancer, it's not a good thing. Somebody that perhaps is dealing with some sort of an addiction, it's not good. And certainly wars are not good. But the Bible does tell us this. It does tell us in Romans 8:28, it says this. It says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." All things, right? I love that word all in there, all things, because it sort of makes you think that He's maybe talking about everything, right? And that's terrific that He's going to use everything for good and for His purpose. So you might be asking yourself then today, how on earth is something really bad going to be used for something good in my life? And there's a number of ways, but I'm going to give you a very simple example to look at that probably isn't biblical, doesn't have anything to do with the Bible necessarily. But I want to talk about salt for just a second, right? Just regular table salt. And when you think about salt, you guys, salt is made up of two things. It's made up of sodium and it's made up of chloride. And both of those things individually are toxic poisons that if you consumed either one of them by itself, you would die. But when you mix the two, you end up with table salt, right? And a little bit of table salt on our food, it adds some flavor for sure. But also, salt is necessary for us to have health, and it's necessary for us to live. The Bible is filled with stories, you guys. It's from front to back. It's filled with stories of people that believed in God, that had tremendous faith, yet they experienced challenges. They experienced obstacles, suffering in some cases, great loss. They dealt with fear. They dealt with anger. And in some cases, they even dealt with betrayal. Yet, as we look at the stories unfold, story after story in the Bible, what we find is that God managed to use it so often for their good and for His purposes. You know, you take the story of Jonah. If you were here several weeks ago, Pastor Curtis did a talk on Jonah, right? And you think about Jonah. Jonah's this man of God, he's a prophet. And yet, what we read in his story is he got to spend 3 days in the belly of a fish, only to be puked up on the shoreline and sent to go preach a message to the worst group of people on the planet, a modern-day equivalent of probably ISIS. This is who he was heading into to go talk to and preach the Word of God. God had a purpose for that guy, right? He was going to do His will with that guy. Take Job. Job, what a story, right? If you get a chance to read the story of Job, it doesn't get a whole lot worse than what Satan did to Job. He ran Job through the ringer, all in an effort to try him to turn from God. That was the whole game. I just want him to turn from God. That was Satan's play. But you know what? Jonah was a man of God, and he wasn't having any part of it. Or Job was a man of God, and he wasn't having any part of it. And Job, he gave us an example. He told us, he showed us that we're all going to deal with incredibly difficult times. And he showed us how to stay faithful through the process. You know, King David, we think of the great King David, right? And there's so many cool stories. As kids, we hear about David and Goliath, and it's such a great story. And we look at David, and you know, Jesus himself comes out of the lineage, the downline of David. And so it's such a great king to know about. But what we sometimes don't talk about when we talk about King David is that there was a period in time where David was hiding out in caves, fearful for his life, because King Saul was trying to hunt him down and kill him. How about Joseph, right? Joseph, one of my favorite characters in all of the Bible. I love Joseph. And you look at Joseph's life, and here he had all these brothers. Would have been difficult to live with all those brothers, but they made it more difficult because they didn't like him. They were jealous of him. They were envious of him for whatever reason. And they did what any group of brothers would do to their younger brother, and they sold him off into slavery, right? Can you imagine? As if that wasn't bad enough. Here Joseph is. He's in a faraway land, sold off into slavery. Things couldn't get a whole lot worse, but they did. Then he was ultimately accused of wrongdoing, and he gets sent to prison for a number of years. But he was a man of God, and he had faith in no other. And Joseph maintained that faith, and God had a purpose for him, and God had a plan for him. And ultimately, when we get to the end of the story of Joseph, we find that he becomes one of the most powerful people in all of Egypt and shows incredible forgiveness. Moses. I love Moses. What a biblical hero, right? Everybody wants to be like Moses. And Moses, here he is. He goes in and he frees the Israelites after 400 years of captivity. He goes in and he frees them. And it's such a cool story. We've seen the movie, right? And we've watched it and we've looked at it and we see how he did this and all of these acts that God did to free these Israelites. And then he finds himself right on the edge of the water. And he holds up that staff and he parts the sea, and it's such a cool scene, and they all make it to safety. And then later we find Moses, he brings down the 10 Commandments, of which we still look at today, these incredible commandments that were given to Moses through God. But what we don't often talk about in Moses' life is one of the more important things, and that's that he spent 40 years, you guys, wandering through a desert. 40 years trying to take God's people to the promised land and trying to teach them how to be godly people. I mean, we think we have difficult seasons in our life, right? 40 years in a desert. This is what he went through. How about the disciples, right? These guys, there was nothing easy about their life, right? And these guys gave up everything, and they said, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to put my faith and I'm going to put my hope and my trust in this guy. And after Jesus died, they went on, and their job was to spread the word, to spread the message throughout the world. And they did such a great job of it. But each and every one of them, all but one, died a horrible, gruesome, martyred death. But yet today, 2,000 years later, we get to read their stories. We get to find inspiration from what they did and how they did it and how they lived and who they were, all because they did the work and the will of God. You know, all of these guys, they experienced times in their life where they had to have said, why me? Why is this happening to me? Right? Is this? I'm sure at times they looked to God and they said, is this really all you've got for me, God? Is this as good as it's going to get? Is this my best life now? I'm sure they thought that at some point. And it brings me to the first point on your outline. If you're following along with today's talk and taking notes, first point is this: even when we can't see it, God has a plan and a purpose for our life. So you might be thinking, okay, John, I got it. God's got a plan, He's got a purpose for my life, but why as part of that plan and part of that purpose? And that's a great question, and we're going to cheat a little bit, and we're going to look to the Bible for this answer. And it's such an awesome question, but here's what the Bible tells us. It says that all people suffer as a result of Adam and Eve's sin. All people. I think that just means all of us. And it says that God originally placed Adam and Eve in a state of bliss with no problems of any kind. In other words, they were given a perfect life that we would all want to have. And they only were told, don't sin, right? Don't mess it up, don't sin. But they chose to sin. They were given free will, they were given the choice, and they made the wrong choice. And as a result of this, God decreed that that these folks would have to endure pain, suffering, hardship, and eventually even death. And that all people since then have endured the same outcome. That's encouraging this morning, right? But look, it's easy to blame everything on Adam and Eve, right? We could throw up our hands and blame all of our problems on them and say, wow, if they hadn't screwed up, we'd all be living in the Garden of Eden probably. But here's the reality of it. I think there's been lots of other people that have been faced with making the right choice, and they've made bad choices and suffered the consequences. Anybody in here today ever made a bad decision for the consequences? I know I'm not alone there, right? We could probably spend the whole rest of the afternoon sitting here sharing stories back and forth of all of the things that we've done in our life where we made bad decisions and suffered the consequences. But you know, the Old Testament and the Bible just in general, it's filled with stories of people that did this that we can learn from. And we look to the Old Testament and we see the story of Noah, right? Noah and the flood. It's a great kid's story, right? And all the kids know about it and they think about the ark and the animals. But there was a reason for the flood. The reason for the flood that the world was so filled with evil and corruption and people making bad choices that God said, I can't allow this to go on one day longer. And they had to face the consequences of their actions. Later in the New Testament, we read a story about a city, an evil city, a city filled with sin that God had to destroy. It was called Las Vegas. I mean Sodom and Gomorrah. Sorry, I get those mixed up. And God had to destroy it because of the decisions they were making. And in the New Testament, we find a story about a man named Judas. And Judas was one of Jesus' followers. For crying out loud, he was one of the core 12. He was one of the guys. He was in the inside circle. And yet, this guy decided that he was going to turn on Jesus. He was going to betray Jesus for a few lousy pieces of silver. And in doing that, he had to suffer the consequences. But his consequences were that he couldn't go on living anymore with himself. I think the guilt overtook him and he couldn't bear it. He realized what he had done and he decided to take his own life. You know, we see it today. We see it in our lives today. It's not just old Bible stories that we read about. We see it today, right? You probably know somebody that's dealing with perhaps a substance abuse of some sort. And as they deal with that, sometimes that leads to sickness. Sometimes it leads to disease, and occasionally, sometimes it even leads to death. We see people with a pornography addiction, and that addiction, it tears apart their family and sometimes dissolves their marriage as a result of this. Or somebody makes a decision that they want to engage in criminal activity and they find themselves sent to prison, destroying their life and their family. And this brings me to point number 2 on your outline, and it's this, and clearly this, is that some struggles are the result of our own bad choices, right? They most certainly are. Our own bad choices often are what get us into trouble. Now, I know some people, though, they would have you believe that the only time things go wrong in our life, that the only time we experience bad things is a result of our. And that's clearly not accurate, nor is it biblical either. We take a look at the life of Jesus, right? Here's a guy that gave us the perfect example of how to live. You don't get to have a better example than the life of Jesus. He lived a perfect life. He lived sin-free, and he did it for us to have an example of how we were to be and how we were to treat others and how we could be if we lived like him. Yet Jesus himself experienced tremendous suffering. He experienced betrayal from his friends, abandonment, ultimately criminal charges, and he was nailed to a cross and experienced a horrible death. You know, we see in the book of John, Jesus speaks and he tells us, he says, here's what you get to look forward to if you decide to follow me. And here's what he tells us. In John 15, verse 18, he says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of this world. This is why the world hates you. Remember what I have told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. Powerful words from Jesus. You know, later we see sort of a follow-up to that verse in 2 Timothy, and it says, in fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Jesus Christ will be persecuted. Everyone. Speaking of suffering, living a tough life, there's a person in the Bible that we don't give a whole lot of thought to, except for maybe a few days out of the year. It seems like right around the Christmas time, and that is Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? We don't talk a lot about Mary other than during the Christmas season and the Christmas story, and I think sometimes as we tell the Mary story and the Christmas story, it tends to be a bit glorified. It tends to be a bit overblown. We hear the Christmas songs and the Silent Night and the Holy Night and hark, the angels are singing, and it sounds so great. But I think if we were actually there in Mary's shoes, it maybe wasn't quite so great as things were taking place. You know, we look at her life and we find that here she was engaged to be married, right? And this was probably a good thing, and she was excited, as any of us would be. We're getting ready to get married, and she's probably picking out her wedding gown and lining up her bridesmaids, right? And getting her cake figured out, and all of this hustle and bustle that goes along with a marriage, right? And here she is preparing for this, but the unexpected took place, and she found out that she was pregnant. She wasn't expecting that one, right? And that was not an okay thing. This was not a good thing in her day, in her age, and in her culture, within the Jewish community. This was not received well. She wasn't married yet. And I can only imagine how this must have been for Mary to go have this conversation with her fiancé, Joseph, and to have to break this news to him. Can you imagine how that conversation went? I mean, she had to come up to him and been like, Joseph? You know, I kind of got something I got to tell you. I'm not real sure how I'm going to say this, but, right? I can only imagine what word she chose for this one. But Joseph, we see, as the story progresses, we see Joseph ultimately, he did the right thing, and he married her anyway. And things didn't get better immediately. They in fact got worse. We find out that a census was to take place, and that as a result of this census, Mary and Joseph had to travel back to their home city that they were from. And in traveling back to their home city, the city of Bethlehem, they were currently in Nazareth and they had to get to Bethlehem. Well, this was about a 90-mile journey on the back of a donkey. If you can imagine, a 90-mile journey with a pregnant wife on the back of a donkey. This could not have been fun. And I think about, you know, we've had a few kids, and I think about our trips to the hospital. Here we were driving in a vehicle less than 10 minutes away. We probably had climate control on, and we had the radio on, and my wife's seat was probably nicely reclined in a comfortable position, and yet there was nothing fun about that drive to the hospital, right? Imagine if it was 90 miles on the back of a donkey through rough terrain and the elements, and that was your pregnancy experience. And they got there, they got to Bethlehem, and the Bible kind of leaves this part of the story out. I'm not sure why, but you know the first thing they did when they got to Bethlehem was they had to go to marriage counseling. But truthfully, they got there, and when they actually got there, the doors were all closed, right? There was no place for them. There was no bed, there was no inn, there was nobody that was willing to take them in. So here they were tired, they were hungry, they were ready to have a baby. And the only thing available in all of Bethlehem was a stinky, yucky barn for them to crawl into and have their baby. Now, I'm sure Mary, at some point here, she had to have thrown her hands in the air and said, "Really, God? Really? Is this how it's going to go down today? This is how things are going to end up today? This miracle pregnancy?" But they had the baby. And then, as the story moves forward, we find that there wasn't a lot of time to hang out and raise your kid and celebrate and have fun. What we find is that there were people that wanted to kill this new baby. They wanted to kill Jesus. And Mary actually had to take the child and had to flee to a foreign land. She had to head to Egypt and hide with her new child. And she had to live there for a few years in hiding. And as we get towards the end of the story, you all know how it ends, right? Jesus, Mary's son, he's eventually betrayed by his own people, right? His friends, they abandoned him and they left him, and he was tried as a criminal. He was sentenced to death on a cross, and Mary, she got to witness it from a front row seat. But here's what I find most remarkable, most incredible about Mary's life. It's how she responded as she went through this. You know, she stayed faithful and she stayed obedient to what she was to do every moment, from the miracle birth announcement to the miracle pregnancy announcement, I should say, through the extreme measures that she took to protect her child and keep him safe, to watching him carry his own cross to his death, watching the crucifixion as he's nailed to a cross. And then finally, her presence at the Pentecost as her and the rest of the disciples received the Holy Spirit. I mean, wow, right? I mean, that is living for God's purpose. I'd like to change gears just for a moment here as we conclude today. I'd like to share a personal story, if that's okay. And this story took place a few years ago, back in 2008, and it's a story of the three years or so of the most difficult years of my life. And it just so happened that these 3 years, they took place right after I became a Christian, right? Good timing, right? And the reason I want to share this story with you is there may be somebody here today. There might be somebody here today that says, I'm thinking of putting my trust and my faith and my hope in Jesus. And I know that if I just do that, life becomes all kittens and butterflies, right? That's what you're thinking perhaps. And I just want to caution that person that while there's a lot of good things that come out of it, it's not all kittens and butterflies. And if you go into it thinking that it is, when things don't turn out your way, you might turn from Jesus. In fact, you might even find yourself blaming Jesus for some of the things that have gone wrong in your life. So, again, in 2008, I became a Christian, and I had just started attending a new church, and my wife and I were attending together, and it was very exciting. And prior to that point, you know, it wasn't that I didn't know who Jesus was. I was familiar with Jesus. I knew of believed he was the Son of God. But there was nothing about me, internally or externally, that would have led you to believe that I was a follower. There was no compelling evidence that I had anything to do with being a Christian. And in fact, quite the opposite. And I remember times before I became a Christian where I couldn't stand Christian music. I know that will seem odd to some of you, but I couldn't stand it. And I would get in the car, and my wife would be playing it, and I couldn't reach for the knob fast enough to change the channel. And I remember saying to her, I don't understand Christian music. How can you have an entire genre of music about the same subject? I mean, at least with country, we had crying, loving, and leaving. I didn't want to give. I certainly wasn't about to give my hard-earned money to the church. That was most certainly a scam, I thought. They just wanted my money. Sound familiar? Anybody? Right? In fact, there was nothing about anything that I was doing that would have made you think I was a Christian. My wife, she used to actually give to the church without me even knowing. She was what I call a closet giver. Right? And so you kind of get a picture of who I was and what I was about. But you know what? I did become a Christian. And when I became a Christian, I knew I wanted to change, and I wanted to change quickly. I wanted to be all in on this Christian thing. And we began to attend church every Sunday. And I began to serve every Sunday. And I was on the setup team and the teardown team and the ushering team, and helping with everything possible, leading groups at my house, and occasionally getting to talk on Sundays. And I was all in, and when we weren't at church, I wanted to get to the Christian bookstore as often as I could because I needed more books on how to become a Christian. I think I read about 5 books on being a Christian before I ever even read the Bible. At this time, my wife and I, we had been trying for about 5 years to have a child, to no luck at all, no success. And we had just about given up. We had just about thrown in the towel when we found out we were pregnant with our first child. Dakota. And what a blessing she was. And so we had our first child, but here's where it gets interesting. Our second pregnancy, shortly after Dakota, ended about halfway through with a miscarriage. I was at work. As a matter of fact, I was in the middle of our Christmas party at work when this took place, and I got the call. And my wife, she was devastated. We were both devastated. We didn't know what to make of it. You know, our first pregnancy went so well, and our first child was here, and we wanted a second so badly. We didn't know where to go and what to do and what to make of it. And eventually, we did have a second child, my son Elijah, blessing number 2. But on Elijah's first birthday, it just so happened to fall on Easter weekend. He was 1 year old, and we were excited about his birthday. We were excited about Easter, and we thought, well, we were going to have family members. We were going to have my wife's mom and dad come visit us and help celebrate. And while they were visiting us, my mother-in-law, she started symptoms. So she went to bed early that night, wasn't feeling good, and the next day when she woke up, she had bruising all over her body. And we rushed her to the hospital. We weren't sure what was going on, and we got her there only to find out that she had a very rare, very fast-moving form of leukemia that had taken over her entire body. And within 24 hours of this, she had gone into a coma. And 24 hours later, she had passed away. She was only 50 years old. This was devastating to my wife and I and the kids. We didn't have great answers for this at the time. And right about this time, I had my dog, a 5-year-old dog, and so this dog was older than my kids and really was my first child. If any of you that don't have kids and you have a dog, you might understand this, but this was my first love and my baby, and I had been training this dog. She was a hunting dog. I had been training her to achieve what was called an AKC Master Hunting title, and I had trained her, and I had poured thousands of hours, not to mention dollars, into training this master hunter. And she finally, at the age of 5, she achieved this honor and this achievement of becoming an AKC Master Hunting Dog. And I was so proud of her. And a couple months after this took place, I took her in for a visit to the vet, and they said that she had a horrible stomach virus of some sort that they couldn't fix, and that our only choice was to put her down, and that we would need to put her to sleep. And right as all this was going on, things couldn't get a whole lot worse, but they did. The company I worked for decided it was going to sell. And as a result of the sale, they took my position and they brought somebody in to do my job. And they said, well, John, you can stay, but here's the deal. We're going to have to give you a 70% pay cut, 70, big number, right? 70%. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't have another job lined up. I wasn't anticipating this, and things quickly spiraled out of control, and we started to go into debt. And as a result of this, ultimately, we lost our 3 homes into foreclosures. And eventually, this led us into a bankruptcy. So here we were. We had no money. We had no job. We weren't sure where we were going to live. Things were going a little rough. But here's the good news. Everybody likes the good news part. There's not a lot of good news that comes out of a bankruptcy, right? But God was working behind the scenes on this one. And boy, was he at work. And when you look at a bankruptcy, there's 2 types of bankruptcies. There's a 7 and there's a Chapter 13. And a 7 is kind of what you hope for if you have to go through this. And that's where you get a fresh start. You get to sort of wipe the slate clean and start over. And that's what we were hoping for, but we weren't qualified for it. We weren't able to get it initially, and they kept telling us no, and we kept trying to figure out a way. And finally, one day, our bankruptcy attorney, she was looking through the information, and she came across the line item, and she said, well, I see here on your statements that every paycheck for the last 2 or 3 years, you've given 10% to the church. And she looked at it, and she said, well, we can use that as an expense for you now. And that got us ever so close. It wasn't quite enough to push us over the top, but it put us right on the edge of this Chapter 7 that we wanted. And we didn't know what else to do. And right about that time, we found out that blessing number 3 was on her way, and that was baby Zeta. The combination of, sorry, wasn't going to cry. The combination of baby Zeta and the fact that we had consistently tithed for a number of years it was enough to push us in to this chapter 7. Give us a fresh start. Give us a clean slate. Now, we still didn't have a place to live. We needed that. I had just started a new job, and it was going great, and I was excited about it, but we needed a place to live. And here's where God stepped in an incredible way, and I think he did this purely just to show off because he could. There was a house right across the street from my office. I mean, literally from here to the back of the church was how far this office is from my front door of my office. And it came up for sale. Now, we didn't have any money, and the only thing we had less of than money was good credit. So how were we going to buy a house? So we went and talked to the owners, and they were willing to sell us the house on contract for deed. So we had a home for our 3 kids. And finally, our 4th child showed up, and that was Raina Joy, and what a joy she's been. And guys, ultimately, the greatest blessing of all, probably, out of all of it, is the opportunity to be able to get up here in front of you folks and tell this story and to encourage you that when you're dealing with all that life throws at you, understand that God is in control. He is always in control, and he is great. Now, every day as we went through this, I would say to my wife, every day, it's going to be okay. Don't worry. God is in control. Just keep praying. Everything's going to turn out. I would tell her this over and over and over. And your wife, any of you that are married, you know that your wife loves it when you tell her, stop worrying, it's not going to help anyway. Right? That always goes over well. But here's the deal. You get to choose. You get to choose every day what your attitude is going to be towards God and towards your situations that you're dealt. And if you believe that God can do all things, and if you believe that he is in control, and if you believe that he can move mountains in your lives and conquer your giants and knock down doors for you, literally kick down doors for you that nobody can close, then shouldn't we be living every minute of every day of our lives as if that were the case? Amen. All right? And this brings me to the last point and our final point as we wrap up today, and that's this, that some struggles increase our faith by showing us that God is fully in control. And he is fully in control. Do you believe that today?